Welcome to the Loins of History. My name is Colin, and I'm joined by my co-host Jay. And last week we talked about the New Deal and if it really actually even worked for us. And this week we're going to pick up where we left off. So Jay, it seemed that socialism was kind of falling out of favor after World War II. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Here we are in our series on capitalism and socialism in the United States. And last week we talked about, hey, this is the effect the New Deal had, whether or not it actually worked. Did World War II or the New Deal or neither get us out of the Great Depression? Here we are post World War II, and socialism is no longer that cool anymore. However, capitalism, liberal democracy in the West, World War II, we won. Yay. Ticker tape parades in New York City. Everything's gravy, right? And economically speaking, yeah, that kind of was the case. There were still lots of political issues, but the economies in the United States and in Europe, collectively, what we refer to as the West, things are improving quite a bit. So the main things we're going to talk about in this episode, kind of the big meta narrative, if you will, is that Keynes is king, and Keynes's main thing was government spending. That government spending is what got us out of the Great Depression. It's what we should continue to do. So kind of over the next 30, 40 years, we see government spending rapidly increase regardless of political party in office. And that high government spending is financed by high taxes. So that's kind of key takeaway number one. Number two is that the problem with this is that inflation begins to increase. And if you're not careful with the money supply, and in the 70s, we kind of had this perfect storm of, we came off the gold standard, there was multiple energy crises, and inflation started going through the roof. That led a new economic theory to kind of gain ground. Third takeaway here is that high inflation is what brought in a new economic theory called supply side economics. Keynesianism is also called demand side economics. Supply side economics became really popular in the Reagan administration, so it's also known as Reaganomics. Our listeners might be familiar with trickle-down economics, which is only one part of Reaganomics and usually used by critics. But anyway, those are our three takeaways. High government spending, inflation begins to break the system, and number three, brought in a new economic system called Reaganomics to counter this whole thing.
So Jay, going back to the beginning of that, where we left off, when we talked about the New Deal last time, and even back to the Gilded Age, it seemed like labor unions became very popular. The idea that we've got to collectivize as workers, workers of the world unite, that seemed very popular. I think that it was like 33% of workers were in a union of some sort. In the 50s, that went down to like 10%. So keeping those key takeaways in mind and the fact that we're in this economic boom, do you think that a collectivist idea became unfashionable or unpopular because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really hard when the everyday citizen's quality of life is improving. It's really hard to criticize the current system. And we kind of see when there's times of economic crises and normal people's plight is worse, then all of a sudden those same people, we start questioning the current system, right? And what we see after World War II was, yes, there was an economic boom, but it was different than the economic boom in the United States that, started during the first and second industrial revolution, because normal, average people's lives were improving as opposed to just the wealthy, where coal miners were still killing themselves in the mines. That happened to a much lesser extent, and we see what's called the American dream. Your house, the white picket kids, fence, and your white picket fence. Yeah, which white picket fences are ugly, by the way. Anytime I see a house with a white picket fence, I'm like, God, who came up with this?
Well, you know what? You know what's great with in a very capitalistic society, you can go through and you can get a different kind of fence. You have that choice.
Because this is America. You can do what you want.
Well, it's interesting. I think you don't really start to see a lot of unrest or call for change or any radicalization until the 60s with Vietnam and the civil rights era. But even that, it's not economic. I feel like a lot of the socialists / anarchists were mostly fringe, like the Weather Underground, university students, and some of these fringe movements. And then obviously the anti-war sentiment, but that was like geopolitical. It wasn't economic. It wasn't we are workers being exploited. It is we are young people. We don't want to go fight in Vietnam, or, we feel like we are being, the civil rights era, we are, African Americans. We feel like there's a problem in the country. It wasn't economic in nature. It was geopolitical.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to say something maybe fairly controversial here.
Oh, okay. Bring the controversy.
And this is very much a sidebar from the main thrust of this episode, but I think improving economic conditions for the Black community is what enabled the civil rights movement on the whole. Because as prior to the 50s and the 60s, the Black community didn't have much of a voice. They were extremely poor, were not organized at all. And then all of a sudden in the 50s and the 60s, you start seeing leaders show up, and you start seeing and organizations developed designed to give the Black community a voice. And, I'm not trying to say the Black community got super rich, but you did, there was Black Wall Street, there were major business, like not big business, but
business owners. Well, the unemployment,
improving economic conditions allowed them to organize.
Right. The poverty rate went from something in the high 80s to the low 40s or even high 30s within a couple of years. So that's a massive economic shift. So things may not have been great, but you're right. It definitely allowed some organization and some money within the community to help fund some leaders in a movement. Little leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.
Right. And, the main thrust of the civil rights movement, in my mind, that was so blatantly obvious was that Black people and white people were clearly not treated the same in society. Just thinking about the water fountains, the fact that one says colored and one says white, like that seems unthinkable. But anyway, point being is, yes, I think there were economic factors, and it was actually improving economic conditions that allowed the civil rights movement to take place. For the better.
It's interesting, and that's a pretty good bringing that sidebar on the civil rights movement back to economics. If you were talking about Keynesian economics and government spending, LBJ was one of the biggest government spenders, and he really kicked off a lot of government spending programs that continue to this day. And he, I think, is quoted as saying, "I'm a New Deal politician at heart." And even though he was not maybe socially liberal, and actually in his personal life he was more than likely a very racist and sexist man, on the surface he was an advocate for the civil rights movement, and a lot of his programs were aimed at improving the lives of African Americans as well as just the poor. And he had a war on poverty with the Great Society program. So things like Medicare, Medicaid, all of those had their start. He had education, investments in education and housing as well. The downside to that was there's a lot of debate on the actual success of them. If you look at the numbers and how much money we've spent on the war on poverty, the poverty rate compared to, from now to the 60s is actually about the same. So there's a lot of debate on this government spending. And me personally, I think this is kind of, he had this New Deal 2.0, and I think this is really what kicked it off. I know Nixon was also a Keynesian economist, and he loved government spending, but LBJ really started the ball rolling again after World War II.
Yeah, and this is good. So let's talk about how federal government policy adapted, because it's interesting that socialism declined. I don't think we mentioned this before, but at the end of World War II, there were about 33% of all American workers were unionized, where currently only 10% of American workers are unionized. So this is a trend that has even continued to today. But socialism declines, but capitalism, through Keynesian economics and through the Democratic Party's policies, have adopted a lot of like assumptions of socialism without technically becoming socialists themselves. So we talked about this in our last episode with FDR. FDR was not a socialist. However, the New Deal had some socialist foundations to it.
Well, yeah, the Great Society programs. I mean, it is a war on poverty. It's kind of like when we talked about FDR's his economic New Deal, where he said, basically assuring a minimum standard of living, and that is going to come from the government. That's basically what LBJ did. And
Yep.
yes, there's still private property, so you're not a Marxist, but by and large, you are still having the government assure you some rights, and those rights come from the government, and that right is a minimum standard of living provided to you by the taxpayer.
Yeah. I had a buddy of mine who I love and respect, by the way, but he was debating with me one day about, I was talking about the socialist Marxist undercurrents in a lot of thinking in American politics and economics today. And one of his counter arguments was, Jay, no one is talking about seizing the means of production, which from a pure Marxist standpoint, that's true. Like, Marx said, we got to seize the means of production. We have to abolish private property, etc. My counter argument to that, or my thought, is you don't have to seize the means of production if, going back to our definition of power last week, if the government allows you to you own it, but I'm going to make you completely dependent upon me for everything through regulation, through control of the monetary supply, through trade regulations, etc. Then, okay, the government may not own the means of production, but they're by default controlling the means of production. That's basically socialism.
Don't pay your taxes and see how long you own those means of production.
Yeah,
You're right.
I mean, it's a little gray area, but yeah.
It is, and that's still something that's kind of hard to discuss. But as soon as the government starts talking about nationalizing mines and oil and things like that, we've crossed into new territory at that point.
Yeah, and I think one of the main things I would like our listeners to have a key takeaway for just our entire series, right? Our entire series of capitalism and socialism here in the United States is that really during this period, the post-World War II era, there is a major view in the United States, not just held by politicians and academics, but held across the board for everyday citizens, is that we look to the government to stabilize the economy. We look to the government to provide for us in the economy. We want the government that if there is a problem, we want the government to fix it. This is essentially socialist thinking. This is not free enterprise. This is not Adam Smith style capitalism, where private enterprise are the main drivers for, like, when we see a problem, the individual fixes it. Like, oh, there needs to be a school here. I'll start a school. Oh, there needs to be a hospital here. We'll form a hospital, so on and so forth. And this this view, hey, government fix everything, one of the problems that it creates is that the government is fallible and incapable of fixing all the problems, and in fact creates more problems itself. And we saw this in the 70s, and we're seeing it today.
It's kind of an interesting, the markets are efficient, quote unquote. That's one of the great. Every MBA student probably hears that in their economics class, that the market is efficient. And this is really a debate between like, well, what's more efficient at solving a problem, the market in and up by itself or the government intervening? So, and this is not really to comment right or wrong. This is simply a look at the historical facts of this was happening. This was the sentiment. Here's what it led to, and here's how it affects us today. So it's not just an academic exercise of, well, this is exactly what LBJ did, but what LBJ and Nixon did and how it affects today. And that's kind of the mission of the Loins of History. It's connecting to the past to the present. So, diatribe aside, LBJ increased government spending, and that leads it. And then LBJ, not very popular by the time he left office. Got us in a quagmire in Vietnam. All this government spending really didn't go over that well. Nixon wins. What did Nixon do to the economy? A lot of key events happened.
Yeah. Let's zoom into the 70s here, because the 70s are interesting, because you're right. Nixon was a Republican, and after him, Gerald Ford was a Republican. But then Carter was a Democrat. So we've got both political parties. However, they have nearly identical economic theories.
They're very conservative on paper and maybe socially, but not economically speaking. Because I feel like it's kind of tough to be a true follower of Keynes and say that I'm really conservative, because you require a lot of government spending to do so.
Yeah, they may not be fiscally conservative.
Yes, that's the word.
So in the 70s, a lot of things happened, and I'm going to kind of go through this fairly quickly. So one, in 1971, we came off the gold standard. So that was probably the big thing that Nixon did, was he was like, hey, we are no longer making the dollar equivalent to this many. There's a very specific gold measurement. It's like something tons for, $1 equals this much gold. We came off.
It's TONNES too, by the way.
Yeah. Yes. Which Brits and Americans don't measure tons by the way. Fun fact. Anyway, U.S. tons are technically called short tons, whereas a normal ton is a Brit ton. Anyway,
you'll remember that in 20 years at a bar trivia.
Yeah, fun fact. Impress your friends. I think the British ton, TONNES, something like that, is actually 2,200 pounds, whereas the American, we're just 2,000, which is why it's called a short ton. Anyway. See, you learn all kinds of things here at the Loins of History. He took us off the gold standard, which effectively ended Bretton Woods. So really digging into our American U.S. history textbooks from high school. The Bretton Woods Agreement was after World War II, where some of the major economic players basically said, hey, Japan, the UK, a lot of France, a lot of other European nations, not the Soviet Union, by the way, they all came together and said, hey, our currencies are going to come off the gold standard, and our new standard is going to be the US dollar. And the US dollar is going to remain on the gold standard. What this did is it made the US dollar the global reserve currency. The intent here was to stabilize currency exchange rates relative to the dollar. I think they had to keep it like within 1% relative to the dollar to try to stabilize the economy and not create volatility. When the U.S. came off the gold standard in 1971, this de facto killed Bretton Woods, because now the U.S. dollar was subject to wild inflation, theoretically deflation, And I think Bretton Woods didn't formally end until like 76, like 5 years later. But uh, coming off the gold standard and the informal ending of Bretton Woods happened in 71. There were also at least two major energy crises also in the 70s. Energy, without going into too deep a rabbit trail here, but energy is one of those sectors of the economy that has a disproportionate impact on all other sectors of the economy, primarily because it's literally what fuels the entire economy, right? And we've seen this today. In 1973, there was a major oil crisis, and in 1979, there was a big energy crisis. Very big picture, what caused both of these crises was controlling the amount of production from Middle Eastern countries.
Also
Go
known
ahead,
as
Colin.
OPEC. So,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because we look at today, right now, there is some strained relation between the Biden administration and OPEC basically coming out and saying, hey, by the way, we're actually going to cut our production based on this
Bingo.
meeting. And in 1973, it started with an embargo. So countries that supported the Israel in the Yom Kippur War, they were like, hey, we're going to put an oil embargo on you. And immediately prices skyrocket because the energy sector is, especially with oil, is speculative. So basically these companies are like, oh, wow, we're not going to have oil. Price is going to go through the roof, even though it may not technically take effect for a few weeks or even months. Price goes up because they're going to speculate and insulate themselves from that. And then in 1979, there was the Iranian Revolution. So Iran was no longer producing as much oil. And again, that one was actually more about the price increase based on speculation because all these oil companies thought we're not going to have as much oil, even though I think the actual overall amount of oil available decreased by like less than 10%. They jacked up prices like 3 or 4 times, anticipating a much worse oil situation. All that to say, it's interesting to look back at the 70s and this oil crisis and then see like today, we're still having fights with OPEC, and you don't tiptoe or they get mad at you. They can cut your production and really hurt the economy because the American economy and politically speaking, people vote based on gas prices a lot of times. So it's just interesting to see that this is happening again at these key times. You know, Jay, the other thing you brought up with leaving Bretton Woods and leaving the gold standard, that is a contentious point amongst a lot of economists, especially the libertarian community, who is, I'm sure, is a big fan of my criticism. But by and large, when we did that, there's a lot going on in 1971 between U.S.-Chinese relations, and economically speaking, we left the gold standard because there's only a finite supply of gold available, meaning that if we want to increase the money supply, we have to increase the gold supply as well. Mm-hmm. And if we want to fuel economic growth, the growth that we had was no longer simply confined to the United States. It was an international period of economic growth and ties. So between the U.S. and the Chinese, we had trade agreements that would be ratified over the coming decades, where the Chinese would begin to produce the goods that we would then buy and finance. And so you had this interwoven economic system that was international. It's no longer nationalized where you're trading between states, but you're trading between nations now. And in order to fund the growth that was occurring, you need more money. Well, in order to get more money, you have to print more money. You can't just print more money if you're on the gold standard. So we decided to leave that and go to what is called a fiat currency, which is a paper currency backed by, a government entity. In the United States, that government entity is the United States government, and the United States government says you have this $1 that is worth. It is worth what it is backed by the taxpayer. So the ability of the U.S. taxpayer and the U.S. economy to pay back this debt that we owe you. So that's how we get into fiat currency. And the problem with fiat currency can be that consumers can lose faith in that currency because the government is mismanaging it, or they're like, hey, there's actually no real value behind this. and that's bad. Or the government can say, hey, we don't really know what we're doing, and we, for whatever reason, we're going to print a lot more money, and that can contribute to hyperinflation or just inflation in general, which hurts the consumer and can create this really bad situation that we're going to see later in the 70s that Jay's going to talk about. But the point being, I think it's really critical if we look there, because the buying power, I'm looking at a stat right now, $70 in 1971 would be worth like $543 right now. So since we left the gold standard, it's like your buying power went down because of all these inflationary periods that we're going to go over. So just important to look at, and it sets up a lot of what we're going to talk about.
No, Colin, this is a great point. And governments want inflation. and here's why. And this is something that I didn't learn this until, I don't know, maybe a year ago, when I was, looking at my own finances and going like, how the heck, like, what's the best way to protect my own financial situation against the inflation that we're looking at right now? And I'm going to do a free shout out, not sponsored by this guy at all, but there's a YouTube channel called Economics Explained. It sounds like an Aussie. It's fantastic. Really good stuff. So if you're into YouTube, go check out Economics Explained. Anyway, he has this really good YouTube video on what to do in inflation. If you are in debt, inflation helps you. So I'll give an example. And I'm taking this from the Economics Explained guy. Say you bought a house. Let's just, for easy math, you bought a house for $100,000 here. If inflation keeps going up year after year for your 30-year mortgage, your 30-year loan, your money essentially keeps growing, right? So you get more money as time goes on, and with that money, you can use it to pay back your loan, because the price of your loan doesn't go up. It's fixed. It's fixed at the year that you bought it. But as inflation increases, the money supply increases, and you can use those extra dollars to pay off your debt. So if you bought a house for $100,000 and hyperinflation hits tomorrow, and all of a sudden there's, like say we're in the interwar years of Germany, and there's literally millions of marks laying around, you can burn it to feed your home. All of a sudden, your ability to pay off your debt just became really easy because the debt on your home didn't go up. So, one way to look at it is, if you're in debt, inflation is actually a good thing because you can pay off your debt easier. Bringing this back to why governments like inflation is that, as we've talked about in this episode, is that the government's in debt, folks. The government's in big time debt. We're in debt up to our eyeballs.
$31 trillion.
Yeah. There was a great commercial back in the day where this guy was like standing by a pool, and he was like, "Hey man, how's it going?" He's like, "I'm in debt up to my eyeballs." That's what the government's doing. Like, we're in a lot of debt. So governments like to hang out around 2 to 3% inflation, because it makes it easier for the government to pay off its debts. That's kind of why, with increased government spending, you have increased government debt, and that's why inflation's a good thing. The problem is the government isn't always able to control inflation, cough, cough, to what we're going through right now.
It's funny. I think it was a meme or somebody posted it on Twitter or whatever I saw, and I got a chuckle out of it. They said the biggest financial flex right now was buying a home in 2021 for like 2.5 interest, because you're right. Mm-hmm. Buying that home now at 2.5% interest, or excuse me, buying it then at 2.5% interest, if inflation is 8%, and let's say that you do have a job that can give you a pay raise or something, even if it's 6% and you're not necessarily keeping up with inflation, that is a 4% delta between the amount of money being supplied through inflation and what you owe on that house. So it is actually very favorable if you bought a home at the right time. Conversely, in the 70s and what we're starting to see now with interest rates going up, it can be really difficult, especially if you get into a fixed situation. Now, you can always refinance later, and that has its own challenges, but you can. But if you have to put 20% interest down for the first couple of years for your home, that can be really difficult, and it can kill the housing market. The housing market was so hot because interest rates were so low, and there's all this essentially free money. So it caused this boom in the housing market. And we're starting to see it today with, I think it's over 7% now is the average interest rate that you can get on a home. You're seeing that housing market dip. And I'm even noticing homes stay on the market longer and longer and longer. Well, in the 70s, imagine paying 15 to 20% interest on a home. It's no wonder we got into this period that's called stagflation.
Yep.
Jay, do you want to talk about stagflation a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a great transition to the Carter years. So we talked about Bretton Woods. We talked about coming off the gold standard. We talked about the oil and the energy crises in the 70s. Let's talk about stagflation, which is a term that comes up a lot today, but it was actually first coined during the Carter years. Stagflation is an economic conundrum where inflation is increasing, but the economy, so like think GDP, GNP, either stagnates, or what's going on right now is we're in a contraction right now. Which never mind. I'm not going to go off on that tangent. We're in a recession, folks. That's the short of my tangent. Is we're in a recession. It's a midterm year, so people are going to try to gaslight you on that one. But anyway, we are in an economic recession. Inflation is still hanging out around 8-ish percent right now. That's why people talk about stagflation. Obviously, this is problematic. A contracting economy, increasing inflation, common sense tells you that this is bad. So this is what brings in Reaganomics. So we're going to focus on the economic reasons for why Reagan was elected and kind of what he did. There was a lot of other stuff going on. There's the Iran hostage crisis. There's just the general Cold War going on right now. I think we've talked about that in other episodes. I'm sure we'll talk about it in future ones. But economically speaking, stagflation was one of the main reasons why Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. In addition to stagflation, we also in the 70s began seeing a major trade deficit here in the United States. And this has only grown to the present day. What a trade deficit is the United States is currently importing more goods than it's exporting. The reason why that's bad, as you can imagine, is if you are buying more things than you're producing. So if you're a wage laborer, which most of us are, right? Like you're producing money for your home, but yet you're spending more, you would be in a trade. That's a very rough illustration for what a trade deficit is. The United States is buying more things than it's selling. And we've been in this hole since the 70s and we've never come out of it. Fun fact, we are currently with our just our top 10 trading partners in 2021, we are in a $915 billion trade deficit, of which over 1/3 of that, so that's our top 10 trading partners. Over 1/3 of that, $355 billion of that is China alone. Our trade deficit with China is more than like the next 5 combined. Which, fun fact, the next 5 are Mexico, Vietnam, Germany, Japan, and Ireland. But
in Ireland, interesting.
Yeah.
What are we importing? Potatoes? No, I'm just kidding. We probably
Whiskey.
whiskey.
Whiskey and beer. Thank you, Ireland.
It's interesting that it's with I guess China's a massive country, booming economy. Well, their economy was booming. That we went off the gold standard in 1971. That is where the Nixon administration, especially Kissinger, started opening up relations with China. And I had to think, and it's pretty well documented that they had this in mind as well. This idea of this interwoven economies between the Chinese and the U.S. And this is what we have now, this massive trade deficit financed based on fiat currency. So,
yeah,
interesting to see.
So, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's transition to Reaganomics, because Reaganomics marks the first major departure from Keynesian-style economics that we've seen since Keynesian became cool in the Roosevelt administration in the 30s. There are two main policy tangibles for Reaganomics, and that is deregulation and tax cuts. The reason why these are two things is because another name for Reaganomics is supply side economics. This is in contrast to Keynesianism, which Keynes is about demand side economics. He believed that increasing government spending would increase demand, which would then improve the economy, et cetera. We go into those details in our last two episodes, I think. Demand side economics and kind of why inflation during the 70s and Carter years is important to keep in mind here is that supply side economics is intended primarily to combat inflation. So, forgive me, I forget who said this, but one of the key explanations for Reaganomics was that we're going to produce our way out of inflation, hence the supply side economics. So on the deregulation piece, kind of at the tail end of the Carter administration, to be fair, one of the criticisms of Reaganomics was that he actually didn't start the deregulation process. That's actually true. There were some congressional bills that deregulated certain sectors of the economy prior to the Reagan administration and the Carter administration. The first one was the airline industry. But it really did. This continued in force during the Reagan years. And again, to be clear, Reagan's not a member of Congress and can't pass bills. So a lot of this was the Republican Congress during the Reagan years, not necessarily Reagan himself. But the policy was we're going to deregulate certain sectors of industry in order to make them more efficient to encourage them to produce either the good or service that they're providing. So that's kind of the deregulation piece. Then there's the tax cuts, which is really the heart and soul, the bread and butter of Reaganomics. And the reason why tax cuts are important to supply side economics is that when you cut both the corporate and the individual tax rate, that does a few different things. For the corporate tax rate, it increases the labor supply. So another way of saying that is when it's cheaper to do business, i.e., you're not just getting the corporate tax rate is just like a lop off your income if you're a business, right? If it's cheaper to do business, one of the main, if not the main expenses that all businesses face is the cost of their employees. So if it's cheaper to do business, you can hire more employees. So cutting the corporate tax rate increases employment and it causes the businesses to grow, which allows them to produce more of either the good or service that they're providing.
I know everyone is very critical of major corporations, myself included. That being said, any business owner knows that cash is king. Anybody that's in the business world knows that cash is king. And if you have more cash, you can invest more. And companies, if you're right, if you suddenly went to them and said, you are now going to be able to keep 5 to 10% more money that you make, you would immediately turn around and say, okay, we need to hire more people because we're going to invest significantly in new technology, new products. We're going to try and make more because not only do we have more money, but our customers are going to have more money. So if you're in B2B sales or B2C sales, whatever, suddenly there's more money out there and everybody else is going to be buying. So you're like, we need to invest so we can make some of that money. And it creates a feedback loop. And you're also right. People are also the most expensive piece of any business. So people are like, corporations should pay their fair share. Look, I get it. This is not going to be a criticism or a discussion of fairness or equity or anything like that for corporations and their tax rate. But the fact is that the more money that they have, the more money that they will spend. $1 million to a CEO, $1 million a pay raise for a CEO at JP Morgan Chase is nothing when they have literally trillions of dollars under assets under management. So a small corporate tax means they're going to go hire more. If the CEO gets another $1 million, I promise you they're investing billions of dollars back in. So the point is it's effective.
What's interesting here is these cutting the tax rates, like it's undeniable that there were positive impacts on the economy. The criticism of Reaganomics isn't actually, and I'm being slightly obtuse here, but the criticism of Reaganomics is not actually an economic criticism. It's a social and political criticism. The biggest criticism is the increase in economic inequality, because the rich got a lot richer at a faster rate than everyday citizens. But everyday citizens also got to keep more of their money. I think it's like, how dare you raise or lower taxes because the rich earned an extra $1 billion this year and I only earned an extra $3,000 this year. So it's like, wait a minute. So what? Like you got $3,000 extra dollars.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny.
But that's not fair.
Well, what is fair? That's the thing. It gets into this question of like, what is economic fairness? Should everybody have the same, no matter what? If you were to superimpose this criticism, like, well, the wealthy are getting wealthier, and the poor are only getting poorer so much, and okay, they superimpose that criticism onto a picture of like these ultra wealthy Wall Street offices that are, I think Donald Trump had the gold office, and they have these mega millions, and it's just this big, look how much money I have and look how much power I have, and they kind of vilified, and they tried to tie all that in as like, okay, these are greedy industrialists. They're the new Rockefellers. Look at this gaudy office that they bought with all their millions. Then they tie that to Reagan, and a lot of it was, to be honest, kind of a political hit, because yes, the poor did not get wealthy as fast, but the quality of life for the majority of Americans increased. It's like,
right. Yeah, the lower income folks grew. As a matter of fact, from 1981, I believe, to 1983, approximately 3.8 million people rose above the poverty level for their annual income. 3.8 million people. Like, I'm sorry, but the criticism about increasing economic inequality, like, I literally don't care, because the poor, there's less poor. They're making more money. Like, why do they have to make equal amounts of money to the super rich when, I'm sorry, but they're not doing the same level of work. They're not taking the same level of risks. Like, they don't deserve the increasing money relative to the major producers.
If anyone read the book recommendation from a few weeks ago, Atlas Shrugged, it probably took you a month to do it because it's very long, and kind of
It's
heavy in
great.
certain parts, but it's a great book. There's a line, and Milton Friedman also says this. So I don't know who said it first, Ayn Rand or Milton Friedman, but when one of the main characters, they're investigating what happened to 20th Century Motor Company, which was like this state of the art, huge company, kind of like GM at the time. They're trying to investigate why it crashed, and basically it became a communist company and it failed within months. But there was a slogan that they had there toward the end. It said, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." I think that summarizes the idea of fairness that a lot of people had that were critical of Reaganomics, and they thought, well, they don't need that much money. They don't deserve that much money. And you get into this, well, what is equity? What is fairness? Who deserves more money? And like you said, does the person that takes more risk and have a little bit more inherent ability to make money deserve more or less? Does this person who is poor need more, do they deserve more money? Essentially that tagline, if you've read the book, it leads to a failure. Nobody works. Nobody wants to produce anything because the people that need get more and the people that work actually get less. So it creates this conundrum, and it ends up destroying one of the largest companies. And there's a lot of truth behind that. Well, who deserves more? Well, maybe if it comes down to it, the simplest way is like, well, whoever produces more gets more. That's kind of what the 80s were at that point. Not perfect, not a perfect system. Going to go ahead and qualify that there. It could have been done better in some places, but by and large, more people got wealthier.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the imperfections of Reaganomics here. But before we do, let's give the details on inflation, because I tried to say, like, the main driver of economics was stagflation. Inflation basically evaporated because of Reaganomics. In 1980, the inflation rate was 13.5%. Folks, I don't even know if it touched 9% currently. Like, everyone's screaming bloody murder with how bad inflation is right now. I think it only got up to 8 or 9% or something like that.
It's 8.2. It's 8.2% right now, and that has only been about a year and a half. That's the average
inflation rate.
That's the average.
Yeah.
That's the average inflation. It's only been like that for about a year. If you were to go back to the 70s, it was like 7 or 8 years of inflation at that rate, and then it hits it hits 13.5%. Just to show you, to contrast the economic pain that people were feeling in the 70s.
So Reagan got elected in 1980. He took office in January of 81. By 1983, inflation was 3%. 3%, which is that's where the Fed tries to target inflation, between 2 to 3%. So it worked. Like, objectively speaking, it worked. We have been trying to combat inflation for 2 years now, and hasn't happened. So there you go. The
Fed has to increase rates to do so, but they don't want to, because that's going to cause a little bit of pain in the short term. And it's very political.
Well, the current Fed wants to. Jerome Powell is pretty adamant about increasing rates right now.
Well, he needs to do it a lot more than what he's actually doing. That's part of the criticism. And a lot of people know.
Well,
there's a political fight.
I don't know if I agree with that. He's doing major increases, and as a matter of fact, the international community, because the dollar is still the reserve currency, is literally screaming bloody murder right now, because they have not increased their interest rates as much, and we have. And now this is one of the reasons why the dollar is at parity with the euro and the pound right now. We digress. Another thing that I want to talk about for Reaganomics here is the Dow, which the Dow Jones is an industrial average, right? The Dow from 1982 to 1987, so basically the gist of Reagan's term, the Dow grew by 350%. And that's without the help of inflation, by the way. Inflation was gone down, had been down to 3% in 83. So from 82 to 87, the Dow went up 350%. I'm sorry, but that's incredible to happen that fast. A lot of times you'll hear, armchair economists like myself and Colin here talk about like, well, it takes time for new changes in economic policy to impact the economy. And a lot of times administrations are actually benefiting off of their predecessor's policy because it takes time. No, that is garbage. What we see right here is that the things that the Carter administration had been trying to do didn't work. The Keynesian created inflation.
It created stagflation.
Right.
The economy was stagnant and inflation was going up. You couldn't buy anything and you didn't make more money. Plain and simple.
Right. Reaganomics lifted millions of people out of poverty, literally millions, grew the stock market by 350%. Think of all the investments that just exploded during that time, and it completely evaporated inflation. I'm sorry, folks, but that's a good economic policy. However, it did have some drawbacks. So let's talk about that real quick. And here's my one criticism of Reaganomics, which interestingly comes from more, fiscal conservatives like myself. And it doesn't come from Keynesian economics because they actually like this kind of thing. Reagan did not decrease government spending. And because government spending stayed consistent or actually slightly grew in certain areas, the federal debt exploded. As a matter of fact, from 1981 to 1988, the federal debt tripled. And in 1981, the debt to GDP was 31%. So the total federal debt was 31% of GDP. At the end of the Reagan years, it was 50% of GDP.
That's nothing compared to now.
That is nothing compared to now, but like Reagan did not do anything to reverse that trend. Interestingly enough, you know who did? This is slightly outside the topic of our episode. Bill Slick Willie Clinton.
I'll tell you what, he did.
Bill Clinton helped increase the budget. Now, he did it by raising taxes, and that's another thing. But when it comes to government spending...
So did George Bush Sr. That was why he didn't get reelected. Read my lips.
That's right.
No
new taxes.
No new taxes. Boom. He pissed off Ross Perot, and Ross Perot took away 10% of his vote. That's a topic for another day. But
yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get that in a future one. But my main criticism is because Reagan was not able to reduce government spending, and most importantly, and this is something I think for conservatives to keep in mind, is that Reagan was huge on military spending. Now,
the Star Wars program, legendary.
Right. The benefit was that we basically obliterated the Russians in the Cold War by outspending them in defense spending to where they were like, they broke their own economy trying to keep up with us. But when you look at it from an economic perspective, this was not the beginning, nor is it the current problems. But he didn't do anything to help the problem. Right now, currently, 2022, federal debt to GDP is 138%. So we are spending total government debt is over 138% of GDP. So what that means is if the government didn't spend a dime and the entire GDP was used to pay off our debt, we would pay off most of it in a year, but there would still be 38% left over. That's kind of what that means. This is only problematic when people start losing confidence in the U.S. government's ability to repay its debt, which frankly we're not there. So this is the last thing I'll say before we wrap up here. When you see the national debt ticker like $31 trillion, people panic and grandstand about like, we're in all this debt. And is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Like,
it's not a problem if nobody can collect it.
Well, it's not that they can't collect it. It's that we have the ability to pay it off. Like, and the US government is not insolvent. So when you talk about
that's a good way to put it.
Debt to equity ratios and solvency calculations, if you look at the federal government, we're not insolvent. The federal government is solvent, i.e., it has the ability with high confidence to pay off its debts. So, yes, we're in $31 trillion of debt, but we make a lot of freaking money.
If we wanted to, we could pay it off.
Right. It's only when especially when we start talking debt to equity ratios, what we're really talking about here is risk. And we are going into a much riskier situation as our debt to GDP is increased to 138%. But it's kind of like inflation, right? Like 8 or 9%, 10%, 12% inflation is bad, but hyperinflation is what wrecks economies. So as long as you're not like in this inflation is doubling every hour, which is really
so in
hyperinflation.
Post World War II Hungary, that happened, and then in Zimbabwe in I think the early 2000s, I think they came out with like a $1 trillion bill or something like that, and it was like basically worthless because it was. You're right, it was doubling almost every hour. Which, for any of you math whizzes out there, you will reach $1 trillion very quickly.
Very quickly. Yeah, so that's hyperinflation, and that's where you got to hit the reset button, and everybody kind of hates life for a while. But anyway, that's kind of Reaganomics in a nutshell. So just to kind of recap everything that we've talked about here, and that is because Keynes is king post World War II, government spending was in vogue. It was fashionable. It still is, by the way, but because everyone's a little Keynesian. But government spending explodes. A lot of these are on social programs, so the participation of socialists decline because times are good. Everything's great. However, some cracks in the system started to develop in the 70s. We came off the gold standard, which, by the way, I think was a good decision, but there's negative trade-offs to it. We had an oil crisis in 73, another energy crisis in 79. The trade deficit begins and stagflation hits. And when stagflation hits, people want to change. And that's where you get Ronnie Reagan. And yes, that was on purpose. That's a movie quote. I would love for someone to tell me which movie that came from. We get Reaganomics, lower taxes, deregulation. Paul Volker, we didn't really go into detail on him, but in the Fed, they try to reduce the money supply through high interest rates. And yes, there's trade-offs. What we're going to see is that I think what we're going to talk about in one of our last episodes, kind of getting close to the present day in this episode, what we'll see here in the future was that Reaganomics did not stick in the same way that Keynes' philosophy did. And we'll get more into our present day.
Well, Jay, thanks. That was a great episode. We covered a lot of topics. We're starting to get into the more current events and trying to tie everything together with our series on socialism, capitalism in the United States. I hope this series has been beneficial in helping you understand how the American economy has evolved and how we got to the point we're in today. We're going to finish this mini series out next week when we tie it all together. We talk about some things like Bill Clinton balancing the budget, the Great Recession, and the aftermath and fallout of that, and then bring it up to today. And then we'll move on to a new series on U.S. and Chinese relations and the history behind that. So if you like what we're doing, please support us on Patreon. Take a look at our social media pages. We're trying to be more active and engaging. So if you want to engage with us on Facebook, feel free to do so, or Twitter and Instagram. We're both on there, trying to post more, just to get involved, post some facts, and interact with our fans. So, and if you like what we're doing, give us a 5-star review. That definitely helps the algorithm and gets the message out there on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, things like that. So with all that being said, thank you. Thank you for listening to the Loins of History. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week.